Good evening. I'm Sharon Fradkin, Communications Chair for the League of Women Voters of Sharon Stoughton. On behalf of our league and the Friends of the Sharon Public Library, who is co-sponsoring this program with us, we welcome you to another in our Women in Politics discussion series, tonight featuring Dr. Kaitlin Kelly-Thompson. Our league is working hard to provide educational forums like this, as well as our recent panel discussion on local women in politics, which featured some of Sharon and Stoughton's sitting female office holders talking about their experiences running for office. A Q&A will follow this presentation, so please post any questions you have in the chat function, and I will try to get them answered for you. Rob Rotella, Program Director at Stoughton Media Access Corp., lovingly referred to as SMAC, is facilitating the recording of tonight's forum, which will replay on Stoughton and Sharon local cable channels. So if you prefer not to be seen on screen, you should turn off your video setting now. And we do insist that you all stay muted throughout the whole program. Now, allow me to introduce our speaker, Dr. Kelly Kaitlin-Thompson, and tell you something about her. Her presentation is entitled, From the Streets to City Hall, The Effects of the 2017 Women's March on Women's Representation in Local Government. Dr. Kelly-Thompson is a part-time lecturer at Tufts University and completed her PhD at Purdue University in August 2020. She is currently developing a book project based on her award-winning dissertation, There is Power in a Plaza, Social Movements, Democracy, and Spatial Politics, demonstrating how social movements create democratic spaces that advance inclusion and improve local democracy through the cases of the Gezi Park protests of 2012 and the 2017 women's marches. She currently teaches courses at Tufts University entitled Gender in State and Local Politics and Congress, Public Policy, and Bureaucracy. Alongside teaching, she is involved in an ongoing research collaboration with Dr. S. Laurel Weldon, Dr. Summer Forrester, and Amber Lozvardi on the role of feminist movements in promoting women's economic rights worldwide, as well as a collaboration headed by Dr. Weldon, Dr. Rachel Einwohner, and Dr. Valeria Sinclair Chapman on the concept of active solidarity within social movements. We are honored to have Dr. Kelly-Thompson speak with us this evening. Doctor?
Let me unmute. But first, I just want to thank both the League of Women Voters and the Friends of the Sharon Public Library for inviting me to speak with y'all tonight. Give me 1 second, and I am going to, real quick, share my screen for this presentation. Okay, so tonight I'm going to talk to you about one piece of my larger project that looks specifically at the relationship between women's marches and changes in women's representation in local government that happened after these women's marches. But first, I want to give you guys a little bit more of a background on kind of the larger project, how this fits in, myself as a researcher, why I'm interested in these questions. So first, I'm going to give you guys a quick introduction on me and this project. Then I'm going to give you a little overview of the larger project that this piece fits within. And then I'm going to talk in more depth about the Women's March and women's local representation. So throughout this process, I'm going to try to keep us real focused on understanding how these fit together, while also giving you an idea of kind of the larger project as well as this specific question that I'm talking about today. Okay, so I'm originally from South Texas. I'm from San Antonio and Austin. And in 2012, I had the opportunity to study abroad in Turkey. And while I was there, I noticed that similarly to how in my kind of home city of San Antonio, there's the use of murals and public art that kind of shows the history of the town and talks a little bit about some of the various struggles that have happened. So for example, this mural right in the middle, which depicts Emma Tinayuka, who's kind of a famous labor organizer in San Antonio. Whereas in Istanbul, I was noticing that there was a lot of political graffiti, and different neighborhoods kind of had a different political bent. And this got me really interested in this question of like, what is the relationship between the space of the city and kind of the politics of the city? And why is it that we have kind of some neighborhoods that seem to lean one way and some neighborhoods that lead to another? And then in 2013, I was kind of starting my normal day and the Gezi Park protests started. And one of the things that happened with these protests was we found that after the protests, there were new alliances between different kind of social movements. So, for example, after the Gezi Park protests, we see record numbers at Istanbul Pride. Likewise, we find that there were a lot of moments where this kind of new relationships between very religious Turkish people and very non-religious Turkish people who were working together in ways that had not been seen before. And this kind of opened this question for me of, when do protests lead to better local democracy? So one of the things that happened after the Gezi Park protests is we saw new people running for office, we saw new relationships, we saw a real shift in thinking about kind of what does democracy look like in Istanbul. And one of the things when thinking about this question, right, is if what was happening in Gezi is something that can happen in other places, where might we see this? When might this happen? And I was really interested in this question, right? So when will protests deepen local democracy? And this is the question that kind of shapes most of my work, both within this project and outside of this project. So when thinking about when protest might lead to better local democracy, kind of the first question then is, right, what do I mean by better democracy? So I draw on a lot of the work by scholars such as Iris Marion Young and Chantal Mouffe, Jane Mansbridge, who are all scholars who are thinking about democracy and who are really thinking about how some people have been excluded from the democratic process and how we can create a democracy where more people are a part of the process, right? So, for example, we know, right, women didn't have the vote till 1920 for white women, until the 1960s for Black women in the United States. And what does it mean to be excluded from the democratic process, right? And when we're thinking about that, we also think about things like, when are women elected to public office? Because when do women have a seat at the table in terms of who's making political decisions? So when thinking about inclusive democracy, I'm very much thinking about who is included in the process, whose voice is heard, and whose voice is able to make change. So when thinking about this, I'm also thinking about a literature on inclusive social movements and inclusive protest, which is very much focused on thinking about when do social movements create spaces where we can have people from different backgrounds coming together, working through maybe problems they might have with one another, and do this in a productive way. So clearly, right, the way we think about inclusion, how this works, the people who work on kind of democracy and the people who work on movements are thinking about this in some similar ways. I argue that inclusive social movements then can lead to potentially more inclusive democracy, both in terms of, right, who runs for office, as well as thinking about, what kinds of things, what kinds of change might we see? So not just thinking about who gets to office, but also who's involved in the bureaucracy, who's involved in city government, who's involved in all of these things. And this gets me to kind of the last piece for me, which is also the space of the city itself. So as we know in the United States, there's this long history of things like segregation. And we also know that the way that you do urban planning and urban design, you can make choices that enable more connection across communities, or you can make choices that do not enable connection. So for example, there has been a history in the past of doing things like creating bridges that are too low for buses to get through, to go out to specific suburbs. And that is one way that you can limit who has access to what spaces in the city. And this influences kind of how different people live in the city. So there's this work especially in critical geography, thinking about, how do different people move throughout the city? How are people's lives shaped by the way the city is designed? So for me, we will see protests lead to deepening of local democracy in spaces where we have more inclusive social movements, so movements that think about inclusion. And the space of the city itself can create challenges for developing this inclusion, and movements can take kind of critical action to engage with this space in a way to try to get over those challenges. So, for example, if you are going to try to bring people together, you want to think about, right, is this space accessible to different people? Can other people get to it? But you can also think about things like, for example, protests that talk about trying to get rid of Confederate monuments, for example. This is something that it's something in the city that makes some people feel excluded. Addressing that and thinking about what that means enables us to think about, right, who is included within the locality and who is not. So for me, in spaces where we see both kind of this critical engagement with the space of the city, in cities that are designed in ways that enable more connection across different ways of life, and inclusive movements both together can deepen democracy. Okay, so this is the theoretical approach for the larger project. So this kind of gets to what I actually did to see if this is the case, right? So I think it's the case, but of course I'm a social scientist, so what I think is the case, I have to test it in order to see if it really is. So one of the things I did in terms of the larger project is I have a series of statistical analyses where I use an original data set that includes all 330 cities that had competitive mayoral elections after the 2017 Women's March. So one of the nice things about local politics is there's pretty much always an election in local politics. So I had a nice range of cities to choose from, and I looked at all of them. I also did case studies. So I talked a little bit about the Gezi case, but I also looked at the sister marches in Boston, San Antonio, Pittsburgh, and Amarillo. So these are cities where I found variation in terms of the degree of inclusion within the organizing process itself, differences between the cities in terms of how the movements engaged with the space of the city, which I also think is important. So I have variation across those two dimensions within these 4 marches. And in order to develop my case studies, I used both primary and secondary documents. I conducted interviews. I collected images of a lot of ephemera, so things like protest signs, and I also walked the sites themselves. And this enabled me to get a sense of kind of how were they thinking about the relationship between the Women's March and the cities that they were being held in, as well as thinking about how were these organizers working to try to make sure that their march was inclusive. Because we know that the women's marches, they wanted to be inclusive, but it was sometimes difficult. And I can talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A as well. Okay, so I want to focus on kind of my question for the day, which is thinking about, right, why the Women's March, and also why the Women's March and when women will run for office. So one of the things that I argue is that protest itself is a productive space. So the experience of attending a protest or being involved in that kind of activity can create a sense of, hey, I have people who care about the same things that I do. It can make you feel more empowered. It can bring these things together. And particularly inclusive protest, I argue, can be much more of a space where if you're someone who you've been traditionally excluded from the political process, being in a space where other people are taking effort to make sure that you are included and your concerns are included can be kind of politically empowering. I'm also drawing on a body of literature on women's representation that looks at what we would call political context. So there's a vast literature looking at, when do women run for office and when do women win political office? And one of the things that we know based on this work is that there are some political contexts that are more open to women candidates than others. So for example, more diverse cities with higher levels of education are more likely to elect or be open to women running for House seats, so in US Congress. We also know that, for example, in municipalities that are more diverse, they're more likely to elect women leaders or allow women leaders to run for mayor and city council. There's also some work trying to think about, for example, cities where a League of Women Voters exists is probably more likely to support women candidates running for office than cities where we don't have similar organizations, right? So these are thinking about political context. And I'm arguing that protest itself can help shift the political context to be more open to women candidates. So this gets to kind of the primary question I want to talk about today, which is there an association between the presence of a women's march and increases in the number of women running for local office? So in order to kind of get at my argument that inclusion matters, I first have to demonstrate that protest matters, because if inclusion matters more than just protest itself, we want to know that protest matters first. So this is the question that I'm going to talk about today. So is there an association between the presence of a women's march and increases in the number of women running for local office? So to answer this question, first I have my two hypotheses, which is that cities where a women's march occurred in 2017 will be associated with an increased number of women running for mayor when compared to previous elections, and cities where a women's march occurred in 2017 will be associated with an increase in the number of women of color running for mayor when compared to previous elections. So I distinguish between women as an entire group and women of color because we might expect different effects based on kind of some spaces might be more favorable to white women than to women of color. And there's been a shift in terms of the work on women in politics where we're trying to really understand which contexts are favorable to women of different backgrounds. So in this case, I did kind of women of color together, in part because of low sample size, which I can also discuss in the Q&A. Okay, so to do this, I have my original data set of 330 cities with a competitive mayoral race in 2017. Of these cities, 84 had women's marches. And to develop this data set, I pulled on existing data. So for example, the census data on demographics, the US Council of Mayors data on who is the mayor, Pressman and Chenoweth's data, which is on kind of how many people were at the Women's March, where were their women's marches, as well as MIT election data on things like political ideology. So what percent of the county voted for the Republican candidate, i.e. Donald Trump in 2016, and how many voted for the Democrat. And then I also did original data collection where I looked at campaign materials, election results, candidacy declaration forms, as well as local news coverage and social media presence to assess kind of where were there women candidates. So I'm specifically thinking about people who declared that they were going to run for mayor in these elections that happen kind of immediately after the Women's March. This means that not all of these candidates actually make it all the way through the race, but I'm mostly concerned with this idea of candidate emergence, right? So I think that protests will affect mostly kind of people deciding, hey, I could maybe do this, whereas it might not matter as much down the road in terms of winning, because we know in order for a candidate to win, they have to be a good candidate. And that's a whole other bag of worms. Okay, so in thinking about these, I use statistical models. And so when thinking about that, we have to be really careful about what are our independent variables and what are our dependent variables. So my independent variables are the presence of a women's march in 2017. I use a women-friendly city index. So this enables me to take a lot of the work on political context and put these together. So thinking about kind of the racial, ethnic, class, regional, is it urban, all of this kind of information, and put it together based on previous work that's shown that these things matter, and using similar cutoffs to what matters when we think about US House elections. And then I also include another important independent variable, which is the number of women mayoral candidates in previous elections, because we know, for example, that if a woman has run in the past, this will create positive effects in the future. So seeing someone be the mayor means that you're more likely to be able to see yourself be the mayor. And my dependent variables are the number of women running for mayor and the number of women of color running for mayor. So in these two models, these are the dependent variables. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about these. So I used ordinary least squared regression models, which are very much able to deal with kind of different ways that these variables look. And one of the things I find in terms of my statistical analyses is that yes, a women's march does matter in terms of the number of mayoral candidates who are women in the election following. So when looking at places where there is not a march versus places where there is a march, it is both significant as well as a nice substantive finding. So if you think about, not having a march versus having a march, you're likely to get kind of half a woman. Whereas if we're thinking about numbers of women candidates in previous elections, this is also very much statistically significant, which we would expect based on the previous work on this topic. And we find that, right, as we increase the number of women candidates, you're more likely to have more women running for mayor. Likewise, we find that the Women Friendly City Index is also significant, but the effect size is much smaller. So what is driving increases in the number of women mayoral candidates is much more about if there is a march and if there are women who have run in the past. Okay. When we look at this in terms of women of color candidates, we have similar findings. However, the Women Friendly City Index is not significant and does not seem to be contributing to this. The Women's March is contributing to an increase in the number of women of color mayoral candidates, but the effect size is much smaller, meaning that when we're looking at women aggregated as all women, we're seeing a much larger effect size. So the march seems to be driving more of the increase than when we look at women of color, which indicates that I think we should think more about, right, which marches were more inclusive than others, because we might expect, for example, that a march where Black women did not feel like they were included would not have the same effect as a march where Black women did feel like they were included, if we're thinking about the number of Black women who run for mayor in the future, right, based on my theory. And likewise, we see the number of women of color mayoral candidates in previous elections is very much driving most of this model. Okay. So a couple of key findings from this piece of the project and the larger project. So I do find evidence that the women's marches are associated with more women running for office. So this means that kind of baseline, I am finding something that is supporting my larger theory. That is great. And now I can focus on doing kind of the next cuts. Some of the things I find in terms of my qualitative work, so my interviews with organizers and my case studies, is that how movement organizers engaged with the city did influence their ability to develop inclusion during the organizing process. So for example, the Boston Women's March, the organizers, their first meeting was held in Lexington. And Lexington is not really very accessible to someone who's relying, for example, on public transit from the city of Boston. It takes a couple of buses, it's not very convenient to get to. These kinds of things mean that kind of their original network on who they were drawing from tended to be people who are from the same social class, tended to be people who already knew each other. And this meant that when they were looking around the table and saying, hey, wait, we need to bring in more women who have other perspectives and other ways of thinking, they had to take additional steps to address that. And it was in some ways a struggle. It was a struggle that they succeeded in addressing, but it was not something where they were like, oh, this is easy. They had to do this extra work. In comparison, in San Antonio, the organizers there were drawing on an existing organizing process. So the Mujeres Marcharan Collective, which organizes International Women's Day protests every year. They were already engaging in that process. They already have a way of bringing in lots of different women from lots of different walks of life. And so they were able to kind of just shift that process a little bit to do the Women's March. So these kind of different experiences showed kind of these different ways of thinking about where we are in the city, different connections to different groups did shape some of this. Likewise, women of color in leadership roles in the women's marches played a really important role in terms of responding to critique from potential allies. So, for example, in Pittsburgh, the Women's March organizers, it was an all-white organizing team. And when Black women said, hey, why are you not connecting to the annual summit on racial justice? They said, oh, well, we're just not doing that. There was a lot of back and forth and critique. It did not go well. And there ended up being 2 marches on the day of the Women's March. There was the Our Feminism Must Be Intersectional March, and there was the Women's March. And this was a complicated and frustrating process. In contrast, in Boston, because they were able to bring in women of color on their leadership team, they were able to win. The Indigenous community of Boston said, hey, you're not fully addressing our concerns. We're considering countermarching you. Instead of shutting down that conversation, women of color within the leadership of the march said, okay, here are some strategies for how we can address this problem. Here are some ways that we can make sure and address these critiques and build some solidarity and build some alliances, as opposed to kind of just shutting down and not addressing it. Okay, so I really look forward to your questions, and thank you for attending this talk.
Okay, so here's one of the questions that's kind of regarding the talk, and then we have some regarding the subject. What are boundaries of your research? What do you consider local government? In addition to elected office, do you also look at volunteerism, such as the League, or employment, such as legislative staff? And how do you define women, non-men? Women, comma, non-men, question mark.
Okay, so in terms of this, I think one of the kind of the key boundaries of my work is that I'm mostly thinking about when do women emerge as candidates for local elected office in terms of the quantitative work. So I just, in the presentation, I talked about my findings in terms of mayoral races. I also look at city council races. So really looking at candidates for elected office in competitive elections. So not all mayors are elected, so those are not included appointed mayors, for example. So that's one limitation. In terms of my qualitative work, some of my findings are much more about things like local government bureaucracy. So, for example, in the San Antonio case, one of the outcomes was not necessarily women who were involved in organizing the march becoming more involved in electoral politics, in part because of issues like immigration status, and instead focusing on becoming parts of commissions and things like that through the mayor's office in San Antonio. And so it did seem like there were some pathways through being involved in this process towards being more involved in local government, broadly defined to include things like, right, the bureaucratic wings of the mayor's office, and not necessarily limited to just candidate emergence. So this is one thing. When I'm thinking about local government, I'm mostly thinking about municipal government in this work, though I think that there is an argument that we could expand this to look at, for example, county elections as well. Because just anecdotally, I do know that there were increases in the number of women running for county positions in some spaces as well after 2017. So I think, if this theory transfers, we might be able to see similar associations to what I found in terms of city council and mayoral races in county races. But that would have to, of course, involve another massive data collecting undertaking.
And of course, counties In Florida, counties are it. In
Mm-hmm.
Massachusetts, they are hardly important.
Mm-hmm.
Norfolk County, the county that our league is in, is probably the most prominent county in terms of active activity as a
Mm-hmm.
county. And some of the counties they wanted to shut down. So it's tricky.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Does your research break down women by race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic class, geographic location, age or generation, political party, or special interests such as gun violence prevention or abortion rights? Do the trends you've identified extend equally across all subgroups of women?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this is something where for me, no trend probably follows equally across all subgroups of women. And based on my theory, I would expect that that is where inclusion matters the most in terms of what's actually happening with the movement. So, inclusion meaning, do we see the involvement of like lesbian women in this process? Do we see the involvement of Black women? Do we see the involvement of Latino women? Do we see the involvement of women from different class backgrounds and Indigenous women, right? To me, this really matters in terms of thinking about where we're having inclusion and where we're not having inclusion. And I would expect that in places where the inclusion is happening, we would see kind of a more positive effect on women from different backgrounds. That said, in terms of the statistical findings, there's some limitations in terms of being able to actually break that down because, for example, there are very, very, very few women who run for office first. And then there's also very, very few women who run for office who are not straight women. And there are very few women who run for office who are not white women. So my data set, I have more leverage looking at, for example, white women versus Black women, in part because I have a large number of cities in the South. And we know that, for example, regionally, where you have a higher population, you're more likely to have people running for office. So, for example, that is something that I have some way of thinking about statistically, but it's more difficult quantitatively. Qualitatively, this is where the interview data I think is the most useful because in interviews you're actually able to talk about did these issues come up and how people were thinking about how these issues came up in the process of organizing a women's march and what did that mean for them in terms of their long-term continued involvement in politics. So one question I do ask my interviewees was kind of, okay, you were involved in organizing the women's march. What do you do now? Like, are you still involved? As well as asking about like your previous involvement in this kind of work as well. So there's definitely variation in those interviews in terms of there were some cities where most of the organizers were like, yes, I've been involved in political organizing for a very long time. And this is a part of that life for me, and I've continued to do it. And there were some cities where there were more women who were like, well, I have never really done this before. I did this. It was a really good experience in some cases, and or it was not as good as I wanted it to be in some ways, and it has shaped kind of what I've decided to do after. So there were some people who told me, I took a different path with my career and one that's more politically oriented after this. And there were some people who said, I've really been thinking a little bit more carefully about who I want to do this kind of work with in the future and what organizations I want to be involved in. And it really depended on kind of the experience of the process itself. So I would say in the discussion with individuals, you can get a lot more into kind of how did this experience shape what I did, and you can also get into the kind of different pathways that it takes for different people because we're not everyone has political ambition.
Right.
And we have a lot of research that shows that women in particular, there's some discussion that, how can we get women to be more politically ambitious? Is this one of the reasons why we don't have a lot of women running for office? And I think that, the experience of protest can maybe make people more politically ambitious, but some people, maybe their ambition is to, for example, work um, in some kind of piece of the bureaucracy, or maybe their ambition is to organize a group that does really important work that they think needs to be done. It doesn't always mean running for office.
Right, right. That's a part of the picture. And we did spend some time in our last discussion series with, 6 women basically who ran for office. And we were impressed that, that many women considered running more, they won many of them. And one that did not win is actually running again for state rep.
Mhm.
So, I have a feeling some of that conversation got to her again.
Mhm.
Since the 2017 Women's March followed the election of Donald Trump, is he linked to the trends you've identified?
Mhm.
Can we or should we separate these trends from his election? And did you find opposite or magnified trends after the election of Joe Biden? What
Mhm.
would you expect to find after the 2024 presidential election?
So my data set is bound temporally, so it cannot address like the question of what's happened in terms of Joe Biden. I think, there's an argument that we might see a continuation of this trend in some way as we move forward. For the first question, in terms of the relationship between the Women's March and Trump's election, first, it would be kind of disingenuous to say there's no relationship between the Women's March and Donald Trump's election, because very much it seems clear that there was a relationship between the
Mhm.
two. However, in terms of what I'm looking at, there is an argument that some people have made that Donald Trump's election is what spurred a lot of women to run for office because they saw that as a threat and they reacted. However, the way I see it, if Donald Trump's election is what was spurring women to run for office, we would expect to mostly see women running for office in more blue areas and more areas that were maybe feeling more threatened by Trump's election, right? And what I find in my data set and what we find in terms of looking at the women's marches themselves is that we actually do not only see women's marches happening in kind of blue areas. So there are a good number of women's marches that happen in dominant Republican areas. They're much smaller, and sometimes, but we actually do see a lot of those. And so for me, this gets at something that we can't necessarily get at when we're just thinking about this as maybe like a Trump threat leads to more women running for office, because we don't see a uniform effect in terms of how people responded to that threat. So if we think about the Women's March as a potential response to that threat, and we see that there's variation in terms of where it happens, then it means that some communities saw that and said, we need to hold a march and remind our community that this is a community that cares about women. And to me, doing that matters. And I do see effects taking into account, right? I include measures of political ideology. So it's not being driven by kind of Trump's Trump winning in terms of Trump winning or not winning a county doesn't wash out the effect of a women's march, right?
Mhm.
So since we can control for that and we can see that there's variation in women's marches in both kind of red and blue areas, it seems like if you have a blue area where a women's march occurs, the women's march is still driving some of why women are running for office.
Right. That makes
So,
sense, actually.
yeah. Yeah. So like if it was a uniform effect, or if it was something where it was like, oh, this is only about Trump, we might expect that the same thing to happen in cities that didn't hold a women's march and cities that did hold a women's march that are
Right.
similar ideologically, right? And so for me, I think this is like a really important thing of it's not just, oh, threat is making women run for office. It's like threat and the reminder from the community that like there is support, or there is space for this, or we think about this. This is something we care about. And so that experience of being like, I feel threatened right now, and then seeing other people who agree with you, you're like, oh, I feel like maybe I should do something, and look, all these other people also want to do something. So maybe I'll do something. And I think, at least anecdotally, there is some evidence that there are women who explicitly were like, yeah, I went to the Women's March. I'd considered running before. The people I knew who also were into the Women's March were like, you should really run. And that, that actually mattered. So this is something where I think because I'm able to control for it statistically, we can see that it's not necessarily just about Donald Trump, it's about something else as well.
Interesting. Despite these trends, what are the challenges to increased women's representation in local government? What can we do to reduce these barriers?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this is something that everyone who studies women in politics, this is like the question that we're all trying to answer, all of us who study it in terms of local politics in particular, right? We're all trying to figure out how do we address the fact that women are underrepresented at the local level? And how do we make the local level a more open space for women candidates, because we also know that it matters in terms of the later pipeline, right? So if you don't have women running for local office, then you don't have women running for state office. You don't have women running for state office, then you don't have a pool of candidates for national office. This is how people kind of cut their teeth and become better politicians and develop the skills they need to be able to be a House representative or a Senate candidate, right? So when we're thinking about women running for local office, a lot of work actually shows that things like, are there candidate trainings? Are there ways to like get funding to be able to run your campaign? We know that women sometimes have more difficulty getting contributions monetarily. We know that there are things that we can do in terms of people who are, interested in doing that, in terms of, identifying potentially qualified candidates. We also know from the political ambition literature that women are much less likely to have someone in their community say, hey, I think you should run for office. And we know that that actually matters. Saying to someone who you think is a qualified candidate, like, I think you would be a really great person to run for city council, or I think you'd be a really great mayor. That kind of feedback also helps women. So this is part of kind of the wider literature. There are things we cannot control, like some demographics are more friendly to women candidates than others. But there are things that we can control, like encouraging qualified candidates, giving women candidates money, doing things like volunteering on campaigns and knocking on doors for women candidates who we believe in, right? That kind of work does matter in terms of getting more women elected.
All right, thanks. Many more people attend an event, i.e., presentation, march, rally, than get involved in an organization or run for office. What helps persuade people to do more? What can we do as an organization?
So my work is mostly focused on like how do we create more inclusive movements and organizations? So how do we get people who normally feel excluded involved in the process? And for me, one of my primary findings is things like where you hold your meetings counts, which feels a little, baseline or basic, but where you hold your meeting counts. Do you hold your meeting in a place where people can get there on public transit? Do you hold your meeting at a time where people can have childcare? I mean, especially when we're talking about, women and getting more women involved. We're thinking about things like, or, can you swing, being able to have childcare on site for people so their kid is not bored while you're having your meeting? I mean, I know I was a kid who got pulled to a lot of these kinds of meetings, and, that was a part of my growing up, and I think it was great. But I also know parents who are like, oh, I don't want to put my daughter in front of a screen for this meeting to try to get, this issue addressed. And it's an issue I care about, but I do want, my kid to have
I
a good.
mean, women surely are juggling a lot of balls
Yeah.
these days.
Yeah.
And so it is difficult. And I think things like time of day and things like that make a big difference.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, it's that, and it's, where are you holding it? How are you doing it? And so that's
Right.
what I found. Yeah. And
So
then,
these things have to be considered in order
yeah.
to make the process easier. So some questions now under the gender and politics subject matter, not directly for your presentation. Do you believe that having women in political leadership provides a different kind of voice? Why or why not?
So this is a pretty like fundamental principle, I think, for those of us who do work on what we call descriptive representation. So having someone who looks like you in office, and a lot of times we're talking about women in politics, we're talking about, are you a woman and do you see yourself in political office? Do you see people who are like you? And one of the main arguments for this is that, yes, experiencing the world is different and it's about kind of having a similar lived experience. And if you live through the world in a way where you experience gender discrimination, for example, you're going to see the world a little bit differently and you're going to see policy issues a little bit differently because you're going to see when something kind of hits a button and you're like, wait, why are we, for example, cutting childcare out of this bill? Or why are we doing this, right? Um, and we do have evidence that that does matter at both the kind of the substantive level and sometimes the more symbolic level. So, for example, we do know that, when we're talking about something like the Confederate flag, having, a Black woman senator matters. Or, this matters because someone can say, hey, actually, I think this isn't a non-controversial thing to be tacking to the end of this bill, right? This is not non-controversial. This is something that some people care about. And I know this because I've grown up in a community that cares about this. And so fundamentally for me, it's not just that women have a different perspective, it's that also different women have a different perspective. And we need to be trying to make sure we have the widest possible number of women so that we get that diversity of perspectives in the halls of power. And we understand, that there are issues that some people might find uncontroversial that others find most certainly controversial. We should address that.
Right. And that general thinking, goes through almost every career path anybody has. So often I've experienced, as other women have, I'm a little shorter. Who's designing this supermarket? Who's designing this house? We went in to see some new homes here just to see. The cabinets began above my head. There was no way I would even get to the bottom drawer, but it looked pretty nice because it went up to a big tall ceiling. And, I know, and I don't mean to put men down because they are wonderful people and have a lot of good stuff. But it had to be men because no woman was going to say, yeah, cabinets up there, that's a good idea. So, yeah, it kind of follows through.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And do different issues draw women to run for office than may draw men?
So some of the work on political ambition, for example, shows that women sometimes get involved in politics at that level for different reasons than men. So a lot of women's paths to elected office include things like school boards, because,
Kids.
yeah, if you have, or you come to it through you were a teacher and you're involved in like teacher union work, things like that. We know part of that has to do with things like, pink collar work and kind of where women get sorted.
Did you say pink collar work?
Yeah, pink
Can
collar
you tell
work.
me about that?
Yeah, so pink collar work like healthcare, teaching. These are librarians, careers where they're dominated by women. So if we think about kind of women's paths to office and the kind of issues that you might care about policy wise, and how that might be linked to your professional career, we're going to see kind of different issues driving you to get involved. So for example, if you're a social worker and you're like, man, to really solve this problem, I got to get involved in policy work, you're coming at what policies you think are important a little bit differently than someone who might be coming through the legal field or something like that, right?
Right. That makes sense, of course. Can you provide an example of where you think having a woman in charge made a difference in a situation?
Yeah. I mean, I can probably think of a lot of examples, but I think one of the most important ones, or the story that I like to tell the most, is the Violence Against Women Act. So we know, I mean, and this has been, I think, more recently in the news because when Biden was running for president, there were a lot of pieces talking about Biden's work in terms of the Violence Against Women Act. But one of the things we actually know from looking at the policy itself and how it came into being, one of the reasons why that act got on the agenda was that one of his staffers was a woman with ties to the feminist movement who cared about the issue. So in that case, a staffer caring really mattered. Likewise, we know from the work by Laurel Weldon that having women's policy machinery with women in it, particularly feminist women, matters in terms of getting violence against women policies on the agenda. I think it's important to also note that, right, sometimes having a woman matters, and sometimes having someone who cares about women's issues matters, right? So it doesn't always have to be a woman, but
Right.
I do think that women being in leadership positions does matter at the same time.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
Well, it makes sense to have kind of mixed opinions and mixed ways of looking at things and mixed life experiences, when you're
yeah,
making decisions for a town or
yeah.
a city or whatever.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's also really important to note, right? Not all women care about all issues in the same way. So women have a lot of different
Right.
views on that. So women's leadership definitely does matter, but how it matters and the direction it's going to matter very much varies with the woman herself, and where she's
Right.
coming from.
Right. Exactly. So, what do you hear from female college students? Are they involved in political activities?
Yes, so I teach a number of gender and politics classes, which tend to select for women who are involved in politics.
Right.
I mean, I'm also in a political science department, which just collects for selects for students who are really
Right.
interested and involved in politics. So most of my students are involved in politics in some way or another, or they're interested in a career that would involve being more into politics or less into politics, depending on what they're into. But generally, it's a pretty political crowd. I will say I have had women interested in politics from kind of all sides of the political spectrum since I used to teach at Purdue. So there I had a lot of young Republican women who were interested in pursuing political careers. And they had different concerns about what that career would look like than some of the younger Democratic women that I've had more now that I'm at Tufts. So it's been interesting, kind of the different ways that these kind of young women are looking at their political careers, as well as looking at kind of how their chosen political party they think might react to them or support or not support them in those ambitions, and the things they perceive as being a potential struggle are different in some ways, which I think is interesting.
Right. It's definitely an interesting subject, even locally. And the last question that I have, and if anybody else has any, please let me see them right away. Are there issues around women's political leadership that concern you?
I mean, I think for me, the one concern I have around women's political leadership is there's a tendency to sometimes say, like, oh, if we have a woman, she'll be more peaceful, or she'll be like this, or she'll be like that. Um,
You
and
mean presuming traits that aren't
yeah,
necessarily across the board?
yeah, presuming traits. And I think that this is something that we have to be careful with because it it assumes that women are a specific kind of way and falls into this kind
Right.
of gender essentialism thing. And I think, women can be a lot of different ways. I mean, I think most
Right.
recently
Right.
Sheryl Sandberg got some backlash for tweeting, if we had more women leaders, there wouldn't be war. And I would be like, I mean, I think a lot of us know, like, I'm sure there would still be wars if we have women leaders. In fact, we have history where women leaders have gone to war.
Right.
Like, this is not women are
Right.
not inherently more peaceful. And so I think my concerns for women leaders are very similar to my concerns for men leaders, is that,
Hmm. Hmm.
you know, women and men can make similar mistakes, and there's always concerns about, do our leaders actually represent us, and do they actually do what they need to do in a democracy? So for me, it's there's similar concerns for both
Yeah.
leaders.
I mean, and it brings in a whole other field of study from
Uh-huh.
yours of, kind of biology
Mm.
and, the influences, aggressiveness, not aggressive level, to do with male, female stuff.
Yeah, I just tend to think like personally I'm on the side of like different people are different and we're not just biology.
Right, right,
So
right, of course.
so coming from a more social construction perspective on gender, it's like women can be just as aggressive as men. They don't get the same reinforcement on that. There's more punishment if you're aggressive as a woman, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can like expect women to behave a certain way and men a certain way.
Right.
So when we're thinking about
And
our leaders, we should hold them both to high standards.
right, right. And women, their involvement in society has changed
Mhm.
over the last, 30, 40 years. So, everything else goes along with it. Um, I want to thank you very much on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Sharon Stoughton and the Friends of Sharon Public Library. We're so glad you could be with us tonight, and we especially appreciate your long presentation, which was just fascinatingly interesting. For more information, people, on our league and the Friends of the Sharon Library, please visit lwvss.org and friendsofsharonpubliclibrary.org, or find our league on Facebook. Also, check your local cable channel upcoming, because this meeting will be replayed a number of times. Recordings of all of our league's programs are always available on our league's website, again, lwvss.org. As our league continues to provide important forums, voter service, and support for legislation, we ask you to join our league and work with important issues and activities. So you can join on that same website, lwvss.org, or just send me money and that'll work too. Thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Kaitlin Kelly-Thompson. We truly appreciate the interest and the fascination of what you've talked about. Thank you all, and good night.